Have you ever noticed something strange? When someone tells you that Mars in your birth chart means you're aggressive and competitive, it feels true. When they say your winter birth makes you prone to depression, you nod along. And here's the disturbing part. For decades, scientists couldn't fully dismiss these claims. Because buried in dusty research papers are findings that made even the most hardened skeptics pause and wonder if the stars might whisper something real after all. This isn't about whether you should check your horoscope tomorrow. This is about the moment when science accidentally stumbled into astrology's territory and found something it couldn't easily explain away. In the 1950s, a French psychologist named Michel Gauquelin decided to do what no serious scientist had done before: actually test astrology with rigorous statistical methods. He wasn't a believer. He was a skeptic armed with data from over 25,000 birth certificates, determined to prove once and for all that planetary positions at birth meant absolutely nothing. He analyzed athletes, scientists, military leaders, writers. And then something impossible happened. The data didn't cooperate with his disbelief. Champion athletes were being born when Mars rose above the horizon or reached its highest point in the sky far more often than random chance would allow. The odds against this pattern occurring randomly were 1 in 5 million. Mars, the planet astrologers had associated with war, aggression, and physical prowess for thousands of years, was showing up in the charts of sports champions with eerie consistency. Gauquelin called it the Mars effect, and it became the most controversial finding in the history of astrology research. What made this discovery so unsettling wasn't just the statistical significance. It was that other researchers tried to debunk it and couldn't. A Belgian committee independently tested the Mars effect in 1967 and replicated Gauquelin's findings. American professors spent years trying to dismantle his methodology, only to eventually conclude that he had adequately controlled for demographic and astronomical factors. German researchers confirmed the eminence effect. The more famous the athlete, the stronger the Mars correlation became. This wasn't supposed to happen. Science was supposed to laugh astrology out of the room, not validate its oldest claims. But here's where it gets darker. The scientific community didn't respond with curiosity, they responded with fury. Committee members resigned in protest when their own data supported Gauquelin's findings. Research was suppressed, manipulated, distorted. One astronomer who defended the Mars effect was essentially cast out of the skeptical community. The controversy revealed something uncomfortable. Scientists were willing to abandon their own principles when the data threatened their worldview. And it wasn't just Mars. Gauquelin found that accomplished scientists tended to be born when Saturn was in specific positions. Military leaders showed correlations with Mars and Jupiter. Writers had connections to Venus and the Moon. These weren't vague sun sign predictions. These were specific, measurable patterns involving actual planetary positions at birth, correlating with life outcomes in ways that defied simple explanation. The patterns aligned disturbingly well with traditional astrological symbolism passed down for millennia. Before you rush off to get your birth chart analyzed, understand that Gauquelin himself rejected most of astrology. He found no evidence for zodiac signs, planetary aspects, or most house positions. Only certain planetary placements near specific angles showed correlations. He eventually proposed neo-astrology, rebuilding the practice from scratch based purely on statistical evidence, discarding thousands of years of tradition that didn't pass rigorous testing. But even this stripped-down version was enough to make the scientific establishment deeply uncomfortable. So what explains the Mars effect? Some researchers suggested it might be related to how planetary positions influence Earth's magnetic field, affecting fetal development. Others pointed to photoperiod during pregnancy, the amount of daylight mothers are exposed to, which affects dopamine and serotonin systems in developing brains. Seasonal factors like temperature, sunlight exposure, and flu virus prevalence vary throughout the year and could imprint lasting changes on developing nervous systems. But none of these explanations fully account for why the correlations would align so precisely with ancient astrological symbolism. Modern research has added strange new layers. Studies from 2010 found that season of birth can have dramatic effects on how biological clocks function in mammals. Baby mice raised in artificial winter light cycles showed slow daily activity patterns that persisted into adulthood, regardless of subsequent light exposure. The researchers emphasized that this isn't astrology, it's seasonal biology. But the implications are eerily similar to what astrologers have claimed for centuries, that the cosmic environment at birth leaves a permanent imprint. Human studies have found correlations between birth season and temperament that refuse to go away. Men born in autumn and winter score higher on novelty-seeking and impulsiveness. Winter births show increased risk for seasonal affective disorder, bipolar depression, and schizophrenia. People born in summer show higher tendencies toward rapid mood swings. Spring and summer births correlate with more excessively positive temperaments. These aren't the planetary correlations Gauquelin found, but they're temporal correlations nonetheless, suggesting that when you're born into the cosmic calendar does seem to matter. A 2014 study found that birth season affects mood-regulating neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, creating detectable differences even in adult life. Hyperthymic temperament, a tendency toward excessive positivity, is significantly higher in those born in spring and summer. Those born in winter are less prone to irritable temperament. Autumn births show lower tendencies toward depressive temperament. The season of your entry into the world appears to influence the neurochemical foundation of your emotional life. But here's what keeps researchers awake at night. These findings remain controversial and inconsistent. Some studies find no correlations at all. The Mars effect has been both confirmed and refuted depending on who's testing and how they're selecting subjects. Critics argue that Gauquelin cherry-picked his data, including only the most eminent athletes, which could create artificial correlations. Supporters counter that eminence is exactly what should matter. We're testing whether planetary positions correlate with exceptional achievement. What we're left with is something maddeningly ambiguous, not proof that astrology works, not proof that it doesn't, just unexplained correlations that hint at connections between cosmic timing and human development that we don't fully understand. The data suggests that something about the temporal environment at birth, whether seasonal light exposure, magnetic field variations, or unknown factors, can influence aspects of temperament and potentially life trajectory. Whether this validates ancient astrological wisdom or merely shows that our ancestors noticed real patterns without understanding their true mechanisms remains an open question. There's another explanation researchers rarely discuss publicly: the Barnum effect combined with self-fulfilling prophecy. When you're told from birth that you're aggressive because Mars was rising, do you unconsciously conform to that identity? When society labels you based on when you appeared in the world, does that labeling become reality through subtle interactions and internalized beliefs? Maybe astrology works not because the stars determine who we are, but because we determine ourselves based on what we believe the stars said about us. The correlation exists, but the causation runs through human psychology, not cosmic forces. This is perhaps the most unsettling possibility, that astrology could be simultaneously false in its mechanisms and true in its effects. That the planets don't actually influence personality, but the ancient system for categorizing people by birth time created self-reinforcing social structures that made the predictions accurate through sheer cultural momentum. That we've been participating in a species-wide psychological experiment for thousands of years, one that shapes reality through collective belief rather than celestial mechanics. Psychologist Bertram Ford demonstrated in 1948 that people will rate vague personality descriptions as highly accurate when told they're personalized. He gave students identical analyses. You have a great need for other people to like you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have considerable unused capacity. Students rated these generic descriptions as 85% accurate on average. This is the Barnum effect, named after showman P.T. Barnum, who understood that a good generic statement has something for everyone. Modern astrology readings exploit this ruthlessly. They're designed to feel specific while remaining universal. They emphasize positive traits people want to believe about themselves. They include just enough negative elements to seem balanced. They use conditional language that allows readers to fill in gaps with their own experiences. The descriptions work because human psychology is predictable in its need for meaning and validation. We're pattern-seeking creatures in a chaotic world, desperate for frameworks that make sense of our experiences. But the Barnum effect alone doesn't explain the Mars effect. Gauquelin's athletes didn't know their Mars positions. They weren't consciously conforming to astrological predictions. The correlations appeared in objective data about planetary positions at birth, not in self-reported personality assessments vulnerable to confirmation bias. Either there's something real in the seasonal and temporal environment at birth that influences development, or the research itself is flawed in ways we haven't fully identified. Perhaps the truth is that astrology has always been a sophisticated psychological technology disguised as cosmic divination. Ancient astrologers noticed that people born at certain times of year tended to share characteristics. They created elaborate symbolic systems to categorize and remember these patterns. They attributed the patterns to planetary gods because that's how pre-scientific cultures explained patterns they couldn't otherwise account for. The system worked not because the mechanisms were correct, but because the observations were real and the symbolic framework was memorable. Modern seasonal birth research validates that the observations were real. People born at different times of year do show statistical differences in temperament, mood vulnerability, and certain cognitive traits. The mechanisms appear to involve photoperiod exposure during pregnancy, maternal vitamin D levels, early immune challenges, and biological clock imprinting during critical developmental windows. None of this requires planetary influence, but all of it validates the core astrological insight that cosmic timing at birth matters in ways that shape who you become. The Gauquelin controversy remains unresolved not because the data is unclear, but because the implications are too uncomfortable for either camp to fully accept. Astrologers don't want to abandon their elaborate systems that Gauquelin's research didn't support. Scientists don't want to acknowledge that there might be subtle temporal factors at birth that influence life outcomes in ways their models don't predict. Both sides would rather fight over methodology than confront the possibility that reality is messier than their preferred narratives allow. What makes this story fascinating isn't whether astrology is true or false. It's what the controversy reveals about how we construct knowledge and defend belief systems. The Mars effect showed that even scientists will manipulate research to avoid conclusions that threaten their worldview. Both communities are more interested in being right than in understanding a genuinely puzzling phenomenon. The seasonal birth effects keep showing up in research. Winter births and schizophrenia risk, summer births and hyperthymic temperament, autumn births and sensation-seeking in males. These correlations are real, replicated, and scientifically accepted. What remains controversial is whether they hint at something deeper about how temporal environment shapes human development in ways we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Gauquelin affair about epistemic humility. The universe is stranger and more complex than our models can capture. Ancient wisdom systems sometimes encode real observations even when their explanatory frameworks are wrong. Modern science sometimes misses real patterns because they don't fit theoretical expectations. The truth usually lives in uncomfortable spaces between competing certainties. So what should you take from all this? Not that you should start planning your life around planetary transits. Not that you should dismiss astrology as pure nonsense. But that the relationship between cosmic timing and human development is more complex than either astrologers or skeptics typically acknowledge. That our birth moment places us in a specific temporal environment with real biological consequences. That ancient systems for categorizing people by birth time may have noticed real patterns even if they misunderstood the mechanisms. The stars don't control your destiny, but the temporal environment of your birth, the season of your arrival, the amount of light your developing brain was exposed to, these factors may influence the neurological substrate upon which your personality develops. Not deterministically, not predictably enough for individual fortune telling, but statistically, across populations, in ways that create real patterns in the noise. Maybe that's what astrology has always been, a pre-scientific attempt to map the relationship between temporal environment and human variation. A symbolic system for encoding observations about how cosmic cycles correlate with earthly patterns, not magic, not mysticism, just pattern recognition without the benefit of modern neuroscience and statistical methodology. The ancients saw the correlations and attributed them to planetary influence. We see the same correlations and attribute them to photoperiod and biological clock imprinting. The patterns remain, only the explanations change. In the end, the science experiments didn't prove astrology true. They proved something perhaps more interesting, that the questions astrology asks about temporal environment and human development are legitimate scientific questions. That dismissing those questions because they come wrapped in mystical language means missing real phenomena. That ancient wisdom and modern science might both be describing the same patterns through different symbolic vocabularies. And maybe the real lesson is this: the universe doesn't care about our categories. It doesn't organize itself according to whether we call something science or pseudoscience. It just is, with all its strange correlations and unexplained patterns, waiting for us to develop better questions. The Gauquelin research showed that our need for certainty often overwhelms our capacity for genuine inquiry. That the most interesting discoveries happen in the places where our assumptions fail and reality refuses to cooperate with our tidy explanations.